Welcome to Leading People with me, Jerry Murray. This is the podcast for leaders and HR decision makers who want to bring out the best in themselves and others. Every other week, I sit down with leading authors, researchers, and practitioners for deep dive conversations about the strategies, insights, and tools that drive personal and organizational success. And in between, I bring you one simple thing, short episodes that deliver practical insights and tips for immediate use. Whether you're here for useful tools or thought-provoking ideas, Leading People is your guide to better leadership. Can neuroscience help you lead better? What if your leadership habits, assumptions, and even your decision-making style were being shaped by unconscious brain patterns? And what if you could train your brain so you could become a more effective, adaptable, and impactful leader? In this episode of Leading People, Professor Patricia Riddell and Ian McDermott reveal how understanding the brain can transform leadership. They explain how neuroplasticity acts like brain sculpting and how you can rewire habits. Why your leadership assumptions may be limiting your own and your team's potential. What neuro-effective leadership really means and how to apply it. And how to create more choice, empathy, and compassion in your leadership. If you've ever wondered why some leadership strategies fail while others thrive, this episode will change the way you think about leadership and performance. So, stay tuned. This is one you won't want to miss. Patricia Riddell and Ian McDermott, welcome to Leading People.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Great. I first met both of you when I trained with you in actually 2016 on your applied neuroscience and the brain and behavior change course. And for our listeners, you've published many books and research papers, and you're here today to talk about neuroscience and leadership, and maybe give us a little sneak preview of what's coming up in your new book that you'll be publishing, I believe, sometime in the not too distant future. And we'll get to all of that shortly. But first, so our listeners can get to know you a little bit better, how did you both get to where you are today? What people, places, or events or epiphany moments stand out in your respective journeys?
So for me, I've been an academic forever and have worked in developmental psychology, actually. So it's quite a long way from where I currently am. But the epiphany for me was when somebody, actually a colleague, asked me why it was that she ran training programs that didn't transfer into the workplace. And could I have a look and tell me what was going wrong in people's brains so that she could make it better? So I went away and had to think about learning and memory and how it transfers. And I came up with some ideas. Because I'm not, that's not my area of expertise, I took it to a colleague of mine and said, this is what I'm thinking of saying about memory and learning. What do you think? And he looked at it and said, everything you say is correct, but I would never have thought of the applications. And for me, that was the moment of thinking, oh my goodness, there's all this stuff that's sitting in neuroscience and psychology that's not actually being transferred and being used usefully. And that's where I started my journey into doing properly applied neuroscience. So I've spent the last 15 or more years just thinking about how can we get the most recent research and translate it into something that people can apply immediately in their own lives. So it's not about teaching people neuroscience, it's helping people to apply neuroscience.
Yeah, and that's one of the great things that I learned from you. And you've got a professorship today, don't you, in applied neuroscience at which university again?
At Reading. But when you get to be a professor, you get to choose what your title is. Okay. And the title, I mean, what I do is neuroscience, but actually what I'm more interested in is application, which is where the applied neuroscience title came from.
Yeah, and that's probably a great segue into your background, Ian. I've got several of your books from your NLP
Yes,
days here, and
indeed.
perhaps you can take us through that journey.
Oh dear. Yes, it really started a long, long time ago. My hair was a different colour at the time, but there you go. Time moves on. And what happened was, originally when I was working with clients, be it their individuals, families, couples, teams, I was interested in what worked, and that's how I ever became familiar with what was known as NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, simply because it was looking for different ways of engaging with different kinds of people using different models rather than saying there is one way and this is it. And that gave rise to a kind of fascination with what really works. And so in my own career, I founded an organization which was dedicated to putting it out there, making it available to anybody who wanted to have practical how-tos. And the result of that was, I felt, both democratizing and demystifying, because people began to know what they could do and how they could do it. And guess what? Success results. Now, does that mean everybody ends up as Mozart? No, it doesn't. But can we go towards a greater capacity that we already have inherently? Yes, we can. And so, the years went on and that flourished, and that indeed it's still going. But I was also aware that there was this tsunami of research that was coming out of the field of neuroscience. And I also knew that I'm not a neuroscientist, and I'm not going to start making grand claims that, yes, neuroscience tells us this, that, and the other. But I did think it would be really remarkable if I could demonstrate what was often referred to as the magic of NLP had research backing. And I endeavored to find some neuroscientists who were interested in exploring this. And I had a number of goes, not very satisfactory. And then by more luck than anything, Trish and I met, and it was, like, boom, immediately, because we both had the same interest, which was, this is all fine and dandy, but how do you apply it? And if you've got just vast amounts of research being generated, if the researchers love doing research, fair enough. But that means nobody's actually taking it out there and saying, yes, if you were to try it this way, you might get a better result. And so it was just a remarkable kind of exploration that then began. And the first thing we had to do was recognize, these are different backgrounds. My background originally was psychotherapy. So you're finding a common language, and how are we going to explore things, and how can we test them to see, is that actually practically useful for people to learn? And so began the journey. We started, and we were thinking about this the other day. I think it was like 15 years ago. And for the last 10 plus years, we've been running a program called Applied Neuroscience, because we wanted to make it bite-sized chunks that people could understand, and here we go again, to demystify and democratize it. And so that has continued. We've refined it over the years, and the net result is we got to a point of saying, think we could legitimately make a contribution now to the literature, but maybe we'll talk about that in a while.
Yeah. So I just can say, for the benefit of the listeners, that I can attest to the chemistry, and yes, and I can also really endorse the program because of what you said. It's quite remarkable how many opportunities there are to talk about the brain and talk about what's going on for people in just ordinary layman's terms without getting too technical. Well, I probably couldn't actually get too technical, but sometimes just to be able to first notice for yourself, right? It's the self-awareness bit that really you start to go, okay, I wonder what's going on for me today, etc., etc. And then being able to also start to notice how people are maybe processing a situation and go, doesn't seem to be the most useful state that they're in at the moment. Maybe we need to talk about something else or reframe or whatever. So there's a whole lot of beautiful stuff that comes out of that. And I personally found I do quite some training sometimes I've been asked to do a few little formal things around the neuroscience. You might be asked to do a little thing on unconscious bias or something. We've used a lot of Kahneman stuff in decision-making courses. But it's not even just doing it formally. It's just that ability to have a chat about it with people and have people go, oh, wow, that never thought of it that way. And that's the beauty of this, I think. And your course is so good at it, because it's not academic, Trish. You give us a little bit, but then you send us off to find out how it works. And we had to do some incredibly, I would call, heavy lifting to actually. You didn't say go away now and we'll see you in a couple of weeks again. You went away and said go away and go off and do something and come back and show us what you did. And we were able to learn not just from you guys, but we also learned from each other a lot as well. So I can endorse that a lot.
That's good to hear, actually. Yes, a student speaks. Yes. And
I stay in touch with other people who've done the course, and they're all, I mean, they're pretty enthusiastic about it. So, but we'll get to some of that a little bit towards the end, because you might have something to say about it towards the end. But let's just get into the whole idea of where neuroscience fits into leadership and particularly coaching. I mean, Patricia, you co-wrote a book a few years ago, which I have behind me here, on the neuroscience of leadership coaching. I mean, Ian, I don't know, I couldn't even count on, take 3, 4, or 5 hands to count the number of books that you've put out on NLP and that. But when we get into, how do you both see neuroscience enhancing coaching and leadership development, and what does the integration of neuroscience offer that traditional leadership approaches might be missing?
Oh, I think a neuroscientist should speak to this first.
On Leading People, the goal is to bring you cutting-edge thought leadership from many of the leading thinkers and practitioners in leadership today. Each guest shares their insights, wisdom, and practical advice so we can all get better at bringing out the best in ourselves and others. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and share a link with friends, family, and colleagues. And stay informed by joining our Leading People LinkedIn community of HR leaders and talent professionals.
So I think there's a number of ways that you can come at this, Jerry. And the first thing I would say is that often it's about really legitimizing what people already know is working. You know, I'm doing this thing. I don't know why it works, but it seems to work. And often just giving people a better understanding of what might be changing in the brain as they're trying these techniques gives them a confidence and a credibility in what they're doing. So I think I would start with saying it's not about completely reinventing either coaching or leadership. But the other thing I would say is that the brain doesn't always do what the layperson thinks it might be doing. And those areas where it's doing something that's unintuitive often mean that we're trying things one way because we think that's the way the brain works. But when you stop and say to people, hold on a minute, that's not actually how it's doing it. It's doing it this way instead. It can really kind of change people into thinking, oh, right, okay, well, if that's the way my brain's working, then it's worth me trying something different. And absolutely, in both leadership and in coaching, I think the main thing that the neuroscience and access to better understanding of the brain can do is it increases your choice. I have so many more ways that I can think about things because I understand how my brain is working. And it increases compassion, and compassion for self first, but also compassion for others. Oh, if that's the way their brain's working, then I shouldn't be surprised that this is the response I'm getting. Now, how might I help them to do something different that would be better for them and probably better for me in the long run too?
And I guess, Ian, this notion of choice has been very prominent in the world of NLP over the years, and being able to have choice and create choices and expand our models of the world. And what's your experience of this because you do a lot of coaching at the C-suite level and that?
Yeah. I think it's perfectly true that the whole idea of being at choice is in itself a significant thought shift for many people. What does it mean to be at choice? You mean, for example, working with somebody very recently who has a CEO, big challenge coming up. My question was simply, so if you're going to be at your best, how do you get to be at your best in preparing? It's a very simple proposition, the idea that if it's going to be challenging, I think I'd like to be firing on all cylinders when the occasion arises. But the how-tos, those are something which neuroscience can actually help us say specifically what will assist and what will actually get in the way. But I think that there are some radical opportunities here, which, and I'll do this as the non-neuroscientist, which are really fundamental for understanding if you're a leader. And one of these is that your understanding of the brain, which may be something you don't spend a lot of time thinking about, it's just like, well, yeah, everybody's got one, I wish I'd use it, and something. But actually, the understanding is frequently extraordinarily out of date. And I know this because of our initial time together. I actually asked Trish, because she's in a field that was not my field, necessarily lay understanding lags behind specialist research. So I'd expect there to be some time lag. And I said to her, what would you say in terms of lay understanding of the brain versus current understanding? What's the time lag? And at the time, the first thing she said was, 20 to 30 years. And I thought, good God, this is like, basically it's extraordinary, but okay, then there's a lot of reason for doing what we're about to start doing. However, the kicker was that Trish came back to me some days later. In fact, you should say this, Trish. What did you say?
At that point, some of the models are 50 years out of date. Now make that 60 to 65 years out of date. So I'm still hearing stuff being said that is 65 years old.
I'm a very left-brain person. Oh yes, I'm sure you are. What are we talking about here? We're not talking about anything of any... it's not real. But the reason why this matters in this context, to answer your question, Jerry, is the perceptions that people have shape their understanding of what is possible. And therefore, if you are talking about your own development, what's possible for you, well, it's all downhill after 25, isn't it? Or whatever nonsense you have, then that's not helpful. But it's far more pernicious than that, because if you're in any leadership role, these are the assumptions you're bringing to the development potential of entire teams of people. You can write off a lot of people through ignorance. And so one of the things for us was, well, what would this mean if you started to understand? Let's take one fundamental concept, which is possibly like the beginning, neuroplasticity. What does that do? If you understand something about that, and again, I'm going to keep my mouth shut for a moment. And Trish, neuroplasticity, who cares? You do, yes.
Before you answer the neuroplasticity, because that's a brilliant topic in itself. What always occurs to me is, because I sometimes joke in my own little way in the room, what prevents this being taught to children and adolescents about, what prevents just talk? Because it seems to me like having a manual for this part of our anatomy, which tends to have a big influence, would be such an obvious thing to have, not at the very technical stuff, although when they get to biology and stuff like that and chemistry, maybe you can start to sprinkle a bit more technically. But what stops the education system just teaching young kids this? Because think of it, if they embed that early on and they just build on that, it would be beautiful. I wish I'd learned it when I was a kid. So without going too deep into it and turning it into a rabbit hole, what's the kind of...
Jerry, I'm just so struck at how Trish and I are both sort of champing at the bit here. Trish.
Well, I completely agree with you, 100%. And it's a passion of mine to see if we can get this into schools as well. And I actually, we've been running some seminars for teachers, and every teacher that we give this information to says, why didn't we learn this in teaching college? So, there's one way that you could do it. You could get it to be part of the teacher's vocabulary, and that way it gets immediately into schools. There are schools that are taking this on board and doing it, so it will happen. It is just a very slow burn.
Okay.
My rather flip answer to your question of why isn't this being taught in schools? Well, that's down to adults. I mean, that's the short answer. And why is that significant? Because if you start talking to kids about, whatever the topic may be, that's something to do with the brain, if you keep it just to straightforward principles of what that makes possible, or some things are difficult and are more difficult because, you immediately have identification, and children are fantastically adept at going, oh, right, yeah, no problem.
And a little example, I was talking to my 8-year-old granddaughter, and she was doing some maths homework, and I was saying to her, when you learn, you get new connections in your brain. They're called synapses. So if you're doing your maths homework, you're getting new synapses. And she just sat there, and she was sitting doing stuff, and she looked up at me and she said, am I getting new synapses now? Yes, you are.
And what was the conversation like in the playground the next day? How many new synapses did you get last night?
Yeah. But you see, even the questions that get asked change.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating, and this is why it really matters to us, is you're changing the terrain of expectations. And that then means that I'm not very good at whatever the topic is, fill in the blank. No, not at the moment. Maybe you're not. But that's not, inherent. Would you like to be? And so if you have any interest in growth mindset, for example, which you could have heard of without any neuroscience at all, my God, there's so much neuroscience to support. Why bother with growth mindset? Because you're opening up a world of possibilities for anyone at any age. Any age.
So let's now get to the neuroplasticity. And I want to take a few seconds just to share a personal experience with this, which was at the end of 2018. My father had a stroke, and, it was, he was lucky they caught it just in time, but he had quite some days in intensive care. But I was at home with him a little while after he came out of hospital, and he was putting little beads into little buckets or things. And it was very frustrating. My father did manual work all his life, so it was very frustrating for him to do this. And he was cursing and swearing. And I said to him, do you know why you're doing it? He said, the physio told me to. I said, well, actually, you're probably trying to teach your brain that there might be another way to do the things. It's not maybe guaranteed, but you're doing something to try and change your brain here. Not because the physio told you. Yes, the physio told you, but I think there was another reason beneath that. But explain to my listeners the power and the value of understanding neuroplasticity. You're listening to Leading People with me, Jerry Murray. My guests today are Professor of Applied Neuroscience, Patricia Riddell, and Executive Coach and leading author, Ian McDermott. Coming up next, Patricia and Ian unpack how your brain balances tasks and relationships. What really happens when leaders create choice, empathy, and compassion, and why state management is key to high-performance leadership. Stay with us. There's so much more to explore.
Oh my goodness, where did you start with that? So I think one of the biggest things for me is to have a better understanding of potential, and to destroy the myth that, as Ian says, it's downhill after a certain age. If we understand the degree to which we can sculpt our brains at any age, then that's a great thing to be able to think. What does that mean is possible for me? What does that give me that I didn't have in terms of belief? And, so for instance, one of the things that we often share with people is the London taxi driver study. And many people have heard about this study, the idea that you can actually see that a part of the brain increases in size when you learn a spatiotemporal map of London. Well, that's a big bit of learning to do. But the most important element of that, and I think it's one that's not often stressed, is that the people were doing the learning in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and even 60s. And age didn't make a difference to the degree to which the hippocampus grew. It was about the experiences that they were giving themselves and taking on. That was the thing that made the difference. So learning is possible at any age if you have the right motivation and the right kind of belief in what you can do.
And in my work, I come across a lot of people in HR asking, we need to establish a person's potential, right? And yet a lot of it is like this, like finger in the air, and they've got 9 boxes which weren't even intended for that. They were intended to evaluate business portfolios, and they say, okay, what's their performance like, and and they put people in these boxes, and yet if they understood what you're talking about, Trish, they'd probably and really wanted to look at that aspect and how what opportunities are people having to learn new things. What are the assumptions about these things in the organization? Is there an assumption that you get to VP and then you don't go to trainings anymore because you've made it and stuff like that? So, but that nicely segues, I think, into this concept that you have created called neuro-effective leadership. And of course, with my own little linguistic background, I go neuro, okay, brain, effective. Oh, wow, that's an interesting word, leadership. So as far as I've heard, you're co-authoring this book. And the questions I would have to get started on it is, who's the book for? What is neuro-effective leadership? And what's the kind of core message you want people to get when they read this book?
Oh, can I kick off, Trish? Yes. Any and all of those, great place to start. So here's the background, which I think probably puts it in context. As we've developed the trainings which take the neuroscience and give practical tools that are how-tos that people can learn and take away and use, we got to a point where we felt that we could codify this in written form for people who may not be able to come to a train. And one of the really fascinating questions of what we would put in such a book was, it's got to be effective, otherwise it doesn't merit inclusion. What we're interested in and have been from the outset is just that. Does it deliver something which is a practical benefit that's going to be valued to an individual, to a team, to an organization, preferably all three? And if so, we have a very simple question we can ask. Is the current way of doing something effective from a neurological point of view? And if we abbreviate that to, is it neuro-effective? We have a question which is an excellent discipline for keeping us on track about what can we say that we know we can now offer because it's been tried and tested. And that's what the book focuses on. We can see many, many applications in different areas, but we still start from that place of, well, does it work? What am I going to get? And how can I use it? That's the short answer.
Yeah.
And I believe there's a subtitle, is there, Leading Yourself and Others? Is that right? Because actually This podcast, the tagline on this podcast is how to bring out the best in yourself and others. That's what leading people.
Exactly.
My concept of this was, you have to start with yourself. So how does that then frame the neuro-effectiveness?
So the reason it's the subtitle is because there's two volumes potentially, and we had to start somewhere. So the neuroscience of so the neuro-effective leadership of self and others, we're talking about techniques that are important both for increasing self-awareness, because if you're not aware of how you're doing things, then it's hard to help people to do things better. So a lot of it is built around how do I increase self-awareness in terms of listening to the signals that I've got available to me and using them effectively to regulate my emotions, to understand how to trust people a bit more, to build empathy with others. I mean, all those sorts of things that are about relationships between self and others. And then thinking about it too in terms of mental health and well-being. You know, how do I maintain a healthy existence while also being in a leadership position? Because so many leaders nowadays seem to be suffering from overwhelm. So how do we help them to build better resilience for themselves and others too?
So I have a question then, because I'm sure if I was putting myself in the shoes of my listeners at the moment, they're probably gagging for some sort of practical examples. What would be a simple technique that you could share that, because of the type of work you've been doing and where you come across, where one or two simple things that people may not be aware of, but when you basically say, what about this, or do this, what would be one or two things that you could share with the listeners there that they could even start to explore whilst they keep listening to this?
So one thing that we found that's really, really powerful is, again, is this new or is this empathy? But empathy comes in two types. So there's empathic concern. I feel what you feel. And there's empathic understanding. I understand how you feel, but I don't need to feel it with you. And we know that under empathic understanding, that more cognitive level of understanding others is linked to compassion and wanting to help people who are in difficult situations. So there's a really simple thing that you can do. I mean, apart from making sure that you put yourself in other people's shoes and take the time to do it, because it's not. We think of empathy as maybe a soft skill, but it's not. It's a hard skill. It's hard in that if you're taking the time to actually imagine what it might be like for somebody else, then that takes a lot of cognitive processing. So it's not just I feel like it, it's I can really imagine it and understand it. But using that to create better relationships, we can talk about empathy. How do I empathize with somebody? And then add and this is what we'll do with it. So I agree with you on this. I'm demonstrating empathy because I've listened to you. I'm repeating back something that's important to you. We're in agreement about that. And here's what we'll do. Or I'm in agreement with you and I'm empathizing with you, but here's the reason that we can't do what you've asked. And that empathy with a response. I was talking to somebody that had been in a course recently, and they just said, it's a game changer. Just always starting with empathy and then decide not giving a really clear reason for what's going to happen next can just take the heat out of a conversation, a difficult conversation.
And of course, Ian, on an NLP level, you kind of have to suspend your assumptions and your mind reading to be able to do empathy. Would that not be?
Well, it's certainly true. Yes, you would need to do that. But Jerry, I think that it's a great question. What would be a practical tip? And if I may, let me interview you on your own podcast for a moment, just because there you are. You're somebody who took the program. What have you used? What have been particularly? Oh, yeah, I don't know. I use that many times.
Well, some free coaching, Ian. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm just interested in the question you ask. There is an experience you've had, and you may have taken things away and found. Well, I quite often refer to that bit of the program as opposed to any other bit of it. Because it's like certain things resonate at certain times with people.
Yeah. Honestly, I suppose one of the first things that I've always been, let's say, very interested since my NLP days in this concept of managing your state. And, if you're not in this, it's this idea, it's like what you asked the CEO, how do you become the best version of yourself? And I've been a performing musician all my life, and I've had to walk out on stages to up to 10,000 people. maybe the next gig's 40 people. The 40 people is more scary because you can see them all. And I guess it's kind of being aware of what's going on within my own neurology and experimenting with, for example, mindfulness. I found that very, very useful for me. Now, I know that for some people it doesn't work in the way of just that silence and self-aware, but I find that a fascinating thing. And we know that helps us understand what's going on, not just at that amygdala level, but maybe on that whole ventrum striatal rewards part of the brain that might also be a bit overstimulated at times. And I found that, and I use that, for example, in virtually every training course I do, or team building or anything. And I've had people say to me, do we have to do this couple of minutes of, I said, no, you see, because if I give you some time and space, it's quite likely your brain's going to start arranging things for you. You never know. And I'll give you an example, Ian, of working with a client not long after I did the course. And it was interesting. It was a small business with a couple of the partners who owned it in the room with these younger people. And I said to them, so in the afternoon, roughly what time do you take a break? And they looked at me like, well, they looked at the partners first, and then they looked at me and went, huh? Like I said, maybe 3:30, 4 o'clock. And one of the partners said, oh, you don't understand. She said, if we start taking breaks at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we could be in the office till 8 o'clock. I said, if you took a break at 4 o'clock for maybe 20 minutes, you could be home at 6. And it was that, and they said, why? Because you probably, if your brain trying to make so many decisions, maybe you're getting stressed. You need to maybe be able to remove yourself. So I just find there's always, like I teach negotiation skills. I have some videos to show what happens if you get provoked. Doesn't matter how clever you are at doing the deals and stacking up stuff. If you're not able to manage yourself in those situations, and you might get provoked and everything, you can actually not be as effective as you thought you would be. There's just a couple of smatterings of things that come along. When my kids are studying, one of my daughters gets stressed out for her exams, and then she gets into that cycle where she can't then rationalize things, and then she gets more upset, and then so we try to get her out and maybe get her for a walk or something, try to get her to rest the brain a little bit and reframe the situation, do something different with her physiology. But I don't know if that answers your question, but that's...
Yeah, I think it does point in a direction of certain things get to be more significant. And, it's going to vary person to person. So one of the things that has been important for us is just being able to think it through, to get it as clear as possible. So in writing the book, we've got chapters that focus on very particular things, like what is it to develop an achieving mindset? How would you know yourself better? And so forth. But also, part one, that would be, and part two is very much about leadership in teams. How are you going to be able to, for example, use neuroscience to promote psychological safety? There are things you can do. They make a difference. Now, we could go into each of these, but one of the things that we've done is we wanted to give ourselves the discipline of how clear can we be. So at the end of every chapter, we've got what have we learned so far? And then how are you going to apply it for yourself? That's personal. And professionally, suggestions. And in that way, we hope to be able to give people very practical suggestions as to what they could have a look at, what they might want to take a bit of time to investigate, and how they could get to know the members of teams, if they're in that situation, rather better, and draw out more of the potential that's there. Because to go back to your HR point, I think it's really tough if you don't have a way of determining, well, what could the potential even be here? We're using certain kinds of distinctions which were never necessarily designed to ascertain that. And, well, you make the best of what you got. But if you start from an understanding that, my golly, this person, their brain is in some ways rather like a muscle. If you use it, you get a lot of a return. Otherwise, you lose a lot. There you go. And it's actually true. It's not just a metaphor. So could we begin to understand that we have an extraordinary amount to get curious about? And that allows us to also think about, what is it I'd really like to be doing that I don't do? Why might that be worth doing? Because it will be fantastically stimulating to brain development by, back to Trish's granddaughter, new neural connections. Oh, new neurons. Oh, yes. It's there for everybody.
One of the things that I notice is this tendency, and I think this goes back to your earlier discussion about how out of date our understanding of the brain is, but there are models out there in the business world, and I mentioned this one before we came on, but I'd like you to maybe talk a bit about it, Trish, is this contingency theory thing where, task versus relationship, and, you have to be able to navigate, you draw one on the x-axis and the other on the y-axis, and then everybody should be able to just jump into that top box. And when I sat, you explained this, and you sort of, and I'll let you explain it, that it's maybe not as easy as people would think when you just look at a diagram in terms of how people are somewhat wired towards a propensity to one or the other as their natural preference. It doesn't mean they can't do the other. Isn't that right?
So this is one of the places where the brain does something very unintuitive. And it's lovely. You start with this idea that leaders should be really good people, but they should also be good at getting the job done. And the way that the brain works is that it brings together the areas of the brain that it needs to fulfill a particular goal. And the areas that you need to fulfill a task are very different from the areas that you would need if you're going to think about others, or you're going to be, think about how I get my team to be doing their best. And that kind of is obvious, that you've got different networks that do those two types of job. The thing that's slightly less intuitive is that when one of those networks is operating, the other one is turned off. So you can only do them one at a time. You can't do them simultaneously. And if you're in an organization, and I'm just reflecting on your organization where they're saying, well, if we take a break at 4:30, then we won't get home till 8. It sounds as if, and we hear this in many organizations, it's task all day. So you're going to be really great at refining that network and making it work really well, just because of the experience you're having, but at the expense of the one that you're inhibiting. You will become less good at being a people person. So how do you balance those two networks so that you're actually able to use both effectively? And this is where taking time comes in, because your brain, while it can't use them both simultaneously, can use them sequentially if you give it sufficient time and space to think.
That's a beautiful summary. I hope our listeners are fantastically curious now about how to do that, and it'll be revealed in the book, I guess. There's another thing that, and we're not too far away from the end, but there's another burning topic at the moment, and in the times we live in, and this is whole idea of uncertainty and rapid change, and how can leaders apply principles from neuroscience and NLP to stay adaptable, manage stress, and help their teams navigate uncertainty more effectively? Maybe, Trish, you'd like to explain what uncertainty does to the brain to get started on this.
Okay, so there's a very wide range of individual differences in our tolerance of uncertainty. And some people are almost enjoy situations that are uncertain and put themselves in new situations often because they got a bit of a buzz out of that. Other people are very much, I like everything to be familiar. I don't like uncertain. It makes me uncomfortable. And so first of all, it will depend on where on that spectrum people sit. But if you're intolerant of uncertainty, if uncertainty bothers you, then that can be a precursor to anxiety. And the anxious mind is not functioning at its best. So while we can't stop people, we can't change, well, you can, but it's better for leaders to recognize that they're going to have a range of tolerance to uncertainty within their team. How do I, as a leader, deal with that? I give people as much certainty as I can. I give them, if I'm describing a new task, I tell them what I know, what they need to know, what they, how I want them to work together. Anything that you can do to increase certainty is going to reduce the intolerance of uncertainty for that job. Mm. So it's a really basic principle of leadership that you should provide as much information as you can. And that will include saying, and here's the things that I'm uncertain about. Because if you're uncertain about it too, then I don't need to be so worried that I'm uncertain about it.
Yeah, because that gives certainty that you're uncertain, basically.
Exactly.
And the concept of allostatic load, it often occurs to me that if a boss has a massive bandwidth and some of their people don't, there could be terrible mismatching and misunderstandings going on in terms of the stress and ability to handle a lot of ambiguity, complexity, etc.
Exactly. I mean, I think of stress as coming into a bucket. And the bucket has lots of different places where stress is added. So it can be added at the work, but it can be added at home. It can be added through your friends and family. It can be added through things that you're doing outside of all of that. And at work, you tend to only see the stress that's added from the workplace. So you don't know what else is in the bucket. So leaders have to be really careful that they're not just imagining that everybody has the same size bucket. They don't. B, that they all have the similar ways of emptying the bucket, because as the stress comes in, you need the ways of releasing the stress. Different people do that less well. And C, that the sources of stress are wide-ranging and come from outside work too. So not everybody is going to be able to do what somebody who finds that they thrive on stress can do. You need to kind of figure out what people's particular tolerance with stress might be.
And Ian, in your conversations with a lot of leaders, what are you hearing about this whole uncertainty and change and stress?
I had a very interesting conversation very recently with a leader who had the experience of his business going into administration quite a few years ago now. And the business came back and it's thriving. And now it's a really tough time. It's expanding. And he was having the same kind of feelings as then. And I was saying, no. This is not the same experience. He'd already told me it wasn't the same experience. He said, this is uncharted territory. So it's like, you haven't been here before, but you're having the same kind of anxiety that you had associated with a different experience many moons ago. So it's really important to understand that I may be having a certain kind of anxiety, but is this the same kind of experience? Or am I just failing to make a sufficient distinction between what was then and what was current now? And very often we are in a situation where the kind of fast thinking is such that brain goes, this is like that. And suddenly the past is running the present. But actually, the present is different. What was then was pretty scary. This could be scary, but it's in an entirely different way. And have you noticed the difference? And being able to make those distinctions is going to be critical. Uncertainty comes in many forms. One of the things that's really striking to me is how sometimes there can be great relief in somebody telling you that there's so much that is unknown, but you'll know when I know. Good leaders do that. But that can also take the form of, I suppose, the extreme example is Churchill when he became Prime Minister, addressing the House of Commons and very early on in the Second World War. He becomes Prime Minister and he says, I have nothing to offer you but blood, toil, sweat, and tears. And the entire House of Commons breathes a sigh of relief. Okay, now we know where we stand. Do we want to play? Actually, yes, we do. Now let's get on with it. So there is something about just telling it like it is can be enormously relieving for people. And that makes a difference. And a leader who has the courage to do that has a profound impact on others.
And it wouldn't be surprising, given the brain's tendency to sort of take these shortcuts, and that the person that you're talking about would see things as the same. It might be just the brain trying to be efficient, because it kind of goes, well, I see the familiarity and just being efficient as a brain saying, it must be the same. And maybe that's another aspect of being aware of how your brain is processing a situation is useful. I have a quick question for you here. Will you be offering any courses or training in neuro-effective leadership?
Well, in a funny sort of way, we already do. Once a year, mid-March is usually the time of year, we run this applied neuroscience program, which is a 10-day program, but not all in one big chunk. We deliberately want it in weekend segments, 2 days each over 5 months. And in that program, we start to explore how can you be neuro-effective, so that it'll complement the book rather nicely. Will we be offering additional programs which give a taste of a particular application? Absolutely. And indeed, we already do. Sometimes we just like to get it out there, and we'll do freebies. We did one recently on rumination, which was kind of fascinating, and that's covered in the neuro-effective book as well. So yes, and if anybody's interested, I think just be in touch with us through our LinkedIn addresses.
Okay, so coming to the end, and this is some final thoughts. So for leaders, maybe especially young or even emerging leaders, understanding how their brains work for and against them could be a real game changer for leaders. And based on your research and experience, what are the most important things leaders need to know about their brains? And if there's one key takeaway that each of you would like to leave us with from your work that you'd like the audience, the listeners, to remember, what would that one thing be?
Do you want to go first, Chris? Well, for me, it would be neuroplasticity, because if you understand that the brain has this extraordinary, just like plasticine, it's malleable, it has the ability to adapt continually and is designed to do so, it makes sense that a lot of people are actually, they're kind of understimulated, which doesn't mean they should be subjecting themselves to pulsing lights and throbbing speakers. It's more just, is there enough in your life to stimulate you and to keep it interesting? Are you doing what you love? All of that will be fantastically growth promoting, literally, in your brain. And sky's the limit. How would you like to be? Well, then get curious about what would help you move in that direction.
And I think if I was to choose one thing, it would be that not to be afraid of listening to your emotions, because they're giving you such a wide-ranging access to information, not only about how you feel, but often emotions arise because of contagion with others. So if you can catch an emotion and think, where did that come from? It can give you a real sensitivity to something that's changed in the room. And that will actually allow you to think about not only why am I feeling like that, but is there somebody in the room that's feeling like that, and how might I then want to do something about that? And here now we start talking about real leadership of self and leadership of others.
Leadership is like charity; it begins at home.
We could spend a whole other podcast just talking about the contagion effect, which we won't for today. We'll invite you back on later. How do people get in touch with you, and do you have anything special you'd like to offer them?
Yes, I think what we'd like to offer them is the opportunity to participate in, let's say, the annual program. Please be in touch, and we'll find a special for you. Everybody loves a special, so we'll definitely be able to do that. How to be in touch? Be in touch on LinkedIn, probably the easiest way.
And just to say that the book is out, it's published with Routledge, and it will be out in June, and people can pre-register in May on the Routledge site.
Great. So thanks, Trish and Ian, for sharing your insights, tips and wisdom with me and my listeners here today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, and I feel like we're only just beginning.
Exactly. Great fun. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Jane.
Coming up on Leading People.
And if that's the case, then how well suited are our organizations or our leaders for that new way of dealing with uncertainty? And what I found and continue to find all around me is they are very, very, very poorly equipped to do so. We are still hanging on to the notion that forecasts can be reliable. We still imagine that we can plan 3-5 years ahead. And in many, many areas, we're still extremely poor at innovating or innovation as a continuous process within any kind of organization.
Next time on Leading People, we welcome Margaret Heffernan, acclaimed thinker, author, and speaker, to explore how embracing uncertainty is the key to unlocking creativity, innovation, and resilience in leadership. We've just spent time in this episode discussing how your brain deals with uncertainty. But what happens when leaders and organizations try to eliminate uncertainty altogether? Margaret argues that this pursuit of certainty is an illusion, and that real leadership comes from learning to thrive in the unknown. So, if today's conversation sparked your curiosity, you won't want to miss this next episode. And remember, before our next full episode, there's another One Simple Thing episode waiting for you. A quick and actionable tip to help you lead and live better. Keep an eye out for it wherever you listen to this podcast. Until next time.